To write a 5,000-word original story in English, applying the formula analyzed above. Let me check the forbidden names first. Margaret Ellsworth, Caroline, Daniel, Walter. I'll create all new characters. Let me write the story now. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who calls a locksmith on her own son. But here I am. And honestly, I'd do it again. Let me back up. My name is Sandra. Well, everyone who knows me calls me Sandy. And I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as an office manager for a mid-size accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio. I raised 2 kids, mostly on my own, after my husband Ray passed from a heart attack when our son was 11 and our daughter was 8. I clipped coupons. I worked overtime. I drove a 15-year-old Chevy until the transmission literally fell apart on I-270. I did what mothers do. I held it together. When I retired 4 years ago, I had one thing I was genuinely proud of besides my kids. A small condo I'd bought in Sarasota, Florida. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, 2nd floor, a little balcony that looked out over a parking lot if you craned your neck just right. But it was mine, paid off. No mortgage. I bought it with money I inherited from my mother and savings I'd scraped together for almost a decade. My plan was to spend my winters there and eventually move down full-time when Columbus winters got to be too much for my knees. That was the plan. My son Kevin is 34. He's a good-looking young man, takes after his father in that way, and he has this charm about him that makes you want to believe everything he says. I believed him for a long time. Longer than I should have. After college, he bounced around a few jobs, restaurant manager, sales rep, a brief and disastrous attempt at being an entrepreneur that cost me about $8,000 I will never see again. When he was 31, he met Tiffany at a rooftop bar in Nashville, where he was living at the time. They got engaged 6 months later. I tried to like Tiffany. I really did. She was pretty and loud in the way that certain people are loud, always the center of every room. Always performing a little bit, always somehow making every conversation circle back to herself. The first time I met her, she spent 40 minutes telling me about the influencer she followed who had completely changed her relationship with money. When I asked what Tiffany did for work, she said she was building her brand. I smiled and passed the breadbasket. Kevin asked me to help pay for their wedding. $17,000, which I understand is not unusual these days, but I want you to understand what that meant for me. I took it from the emergency fund I kept in a CD, the one I always told myself was for medical bills or a new roof. I wrote the check because I loved my son and because I wanted to start this marriage on a good note. I told myself it was an investment in his happiness. Within the first year of their marriage, Kevin called me 3 times about money. Once for help covering 2 months of rent when they moved to a bigger apartment in Nashville. Once because Tiffany's car needed repairs and the timing was just terrible. Once because they were behind on utilities and didn't want to get their power shut off in January. I sent what I could each time. I told myself this was temporary. Young couples struggle. I knew that better than anyone. What I didn't know was that Kevin had told Tiffany I was their backup plan. Not just a mother who helped out occasionally, an actual financial safety net they could pull on whenever things got tight. I found that out later, much later. About 2 years into their marriage, Kevin called me and explained that he and Tiffany were thinking about moving back to Ohio. Nashville had gotten expensive, he said. He wanted to be closer to home. He'd found a job opportunity in Cincinnati. Tiffany's friends were mostly back in the Midwest anyway. It made sense, he said. Then he asked if they could stay in my Sarasota condo just for a little while they got settled. He explained it like this. They needed a base while they apartment hunted in Cincinnati, and since I wasn't using the Florida place right now, it was summer. I stayed in Columbus in the summer. It would just be sitting empty. 2 months, he said. Maybe 3 at the outside. They'd keep it clean. They'd pay the HOA fees while they were there. It would save them money during the transition. I said yes. I don't know exactly why I said yes so easily. I think part of me was glad he was coming back closer to home. Part of me wanted to do something tangible and useful for him, the way I always had, and part of me, the part I don't like to admit to, Was tired of feeling like I was losing him to a life I didn't quite understand, in a city I'd only visited twice, with a woman who still hadn't learned my birthday. So I said yes. 2 months. I wrote down the HOA payment amount and texted it to him. I told him where the spare key was. I reminded him that the balcony door sticks in humidity and you have to lift it slightly as you turn the handle. He said, "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." I hung up feeling like I'd done something good. That was in June. By September, I hadn't heard much from him. A few texts here and there, a phone call on my birthday that lasted about 9 minutes. I assumed they were busy with the move, getting settled in Cincinnati, figuring out the new job. I didn't push. I gave him space the way I always had, the way I always told myself was the right thing to do. In October, I got a call from my friend Rosemary, who lives in Sarasota year-round. We'd been close for almost 15 years, met at a water or box class, and stayed friends through 2 of her divorces and Ray's funeral, and everything in between. Rosemary had seen my car parked outside my building, except my car was in Columbus. She said it wasn't just one car, there were 2. One she didn't recognize at all. She'd seen lights on inside almost every night for weeks. She'd knocked once because she wanted to check in, and a young woman she'd never met had opened the door, looked at her like she was a stranger, and said, "Can I help you?" and then closed the door. I sat very still after I hung up with Rosemary. I called Kevin. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, "Kevin, call me when you get a chance. It's important." Then I sat in my kitchen in Columbus with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought about everything very carefully. He called back 2 hours later. When I asked him if he was still in Sarasota, there was a pause. A short one, but it was there. "Yeah," he said. "We've been a little delayed on the Cincinnati move. Things got complicated with the job offer." "How long have you been planning to stay?" I asked. Another pause. "We were going to talk to you about that." "Talk to me now," I said. What came out over the next 20 minutes in pieces, with long silences between them, was this. The job in Cincinnati had fallen through in July. Kevin hadn't found another one yet. They couldn't afford a security deposit anywhere right now. They'd been living in my condo for 4 months. Tiffany's younger sister had been staying with them temporarily for the last 6 weeks. This was the second car the stranger Rosemary had met at the door. They were figuring it out. I asked if Tiffany was working. He said she was focusing on her content. I took a breath. I kept my voice even. I said, "Kevin, I need you to understand something. That was my property. You had permission to be there for 2 months. You are now 4 months in with an additional person I never agreed to, and you didn't tell me any of this. That is not okay." He said he knew. He said he was sorry. He said he just needed a little more time. I told him I was coming down in 2 weeks. I want to be honest about what I was feeling during those 2 weeks, because I think it matters. I wasn't in a rage. I was something quieter, and in some ways worse than that. I was tired. I was tired in the deep way that only comes from a specific kind of disappointment. Not the kind where someone does something terrible to you out of nowhere, but the kind where you look back and realize you saw this coming for years and kept choosing not to see it. Every unanswered text, every borrowed dollar that was never mentioned again, every time Tiffany looked through me instead of at me. I'd been keeping a running tab in my heart that I told myself I wasn't keeping. I drove down. 14 hours. I stopped once in Georgia for gas and a bad cup of coffee. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the Florida air was just starting to ease off the summer heat. I parked in my assigned spot, my spot with my name on it, the one I paid the HOA fee for every month regardless of whether I was there. And I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got my bag and my purse and I walked upstairs. The door was unlocked. I walked in. The first thing I noticed was that the couch was different. My old loo seat, the one I'd had reupholstered in a pale blue fabric the year after Ray died, because I needed something in my life that felt new, was gone. In its place was a big sectional in dark gray that took up most of the living room. There was a ring light in the corner, a tripod, Tiffany's laptop open on my kitchen table, surrounded by coffee cups. My photographs were gone from the hallway wall. The little row of frames I'd hung there, Ray and me at Niagara Falls, my daughter's college graduation, Kevin, at about age 9, holding up a fish he'd caught at my brother's lake house, grinning like he'd won the lottery. All gone. Nails still in the wall, empty. I set my bag down. Tiffany came out of the bedroom. She was wearing athleisure, hair up, phone in hand, and when she saw me, she stopped. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, not quite guilt, more like calculation. "Sandra," she said, "we didn't know you were coming today." "I told Kevin 2 weeks ago I was coming," I said. "Where are my photographs?" She waved her hand toward the hallway closet. "We just moved some things around. For the content, you know, the aesthetic." I opened the closet. My frames were stacked on the floor, face down. I picked them up one by one and set them on the kitchen counter. My hands were steady. I was proud of that. Kevin came out a few minutes later from the second bedroom. He looked like he hadn't slept well in weeks. He started to say something, but I held up one hand. "Where's the sister?" I said. "She went to the store," Tiffany said. "She needs to have her things out of here by tomorrow morning," I said. "And I need to talk to you both." We sat down, me on one end of their enormous gray sectional, them on the other end, and I looked at my son and I said everything I had been rehearsing in my head for 14 hours of driving. I said it calmly. I said it completely. I told them they had been in my home for 4 months without permission, that they had brought in another person without asking, that they had removed my belongings and rearranged my home, and that none of this was acceptable regardless of their circumstances. Tiffany interrupted me twice. The first time she said that Kevin had told her I was fine with it. I looked at Kevin. He looked at the floor. The second time she interrupted me, she said that I was being dramatic and that family helps family. I said, family also communicates. Family doesn't disappear for 4 months and hope you don't notice. Then I said the thing I'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. I said, I need you to find somewhere else to live. I'm giving you 30 days. Tiffany's face changed then. The calculation disappeared and something harder came in. She stood up from the couch and she said very clearly, "This is our home right now and you can't just come in here and throw us out. Kevin has been staying here with your permission." "Kevin had permission for 2 months," I said. "That was 4 months ago." She said, "We'll see about that." She picked up her phone. I looked at Kevin. "I want to tell you that he stood up for me. I want to tell you that he said something, anything, that showed me he understood what was happening." But he sat there. He looked at the floor and he sat there. Tiffany stepped out onto the balcony to make her call. Through the glass door, I could see her pacing, talking fast. Kevin finally spoke. He said, "Mom, I know this isn't ideal." I said, "Kevin, I love you, but what is happening right now is not about whether I love you. You took advantage of my trust. You brought someone into my property without asking. You have been lying to me for months by omission. That matters regardless of who loves who." He nodded. He still didn't look at me. Tiffany came back inside. She said, "I just called the non-emergency police line. I told them there's a dispute over occupancy. They're sending someone over to help clarify the situation." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "That's fine, I'll wait." I went to my purse. I took out the folder I had brought with me, the one I'd put together over the 2 weeks before I drove down, after I'd spent an evening reading Florida landlord-tenant law and talked for 45 minutes to my neighbor's son, who is a real estate attorney in Cincinnati. Inside that folder, the property deed in my name, my HOA account statements, the utility bills still in my name, and a printed copy of a short-term permission agreement I had asked Kevin to sign, which he had signed in June via email, and which I had printed with the email chain attached showing the 2-month agreed period. I sat down. I opened the folder. I waited. The officer arrived about 20 minutes later. She was a woman in her 40s, professional, unhurried. She asked all three of us to explain the situation. Tiffany spoke first, and she spoke a lot. She said they'd been given permission to stay, that they'd been improving the property, that I had shown up without warning to intimidate them. The officer turned to me. I handed her the folder. I said, I own this property outright. This is the deed. This is the HOA account in my name. This is a signed email agreement between me and my son for a 2-month stay beginning June 3rd. Today is October 28th. The officer read through what I'd given her. She took her time. Then she looked at Kevin and said, Sir, is this your signature? Kevin said yes. The officer handed the folder back to me. Then she looked at Tiffany and said, in the most even possible tone, Ma'am, the property owner has documentation establishing her ownership and the terms of the agreement. This is a civil matter, but I'd strongly advise you to make arrangements to vacate. Tiffany said, But we have nowhere to go. The officer said, I understand that's difficult, but that doesn't change the owner's rights to her property. Tiffany looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at the floor. I thanked the officer. She left. The three of us stood in my living room, and I think we all knew something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. Tiffany went into the bedroom without saying another word. I heard her on the phone in there, voice low and tense. Kevin stood by the kitchen counter. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. He said it quietly, like he meant it, and maybe he did. I've thought about that moment many times since. I said, I know, baby. But sorry and different are two separate things. He nodded. I told him he had until November 28, 30 days. I said I would help him think through options if he wanted to talk, but the conversation had to start with honesty. He could take that or leave it. He took it. He didn't say much else that night. Tiffany's sister left the next morning with 2 suitcases and barely a glance in my direction. I stayed in the condo. I slept in my own bed. I washed the dishes that had been sitting in the sink, and I found my old throw blanket stuffed in the back of the hall closet behind winter coats, and I put it back on the couch where it belonged. I hung my photographs back on the wall. Ray at Niagara Falls. My daughter at graduation. Kevin grinning over that fish like he owned the entire lake. I let myself cry a little, looking at that photo. Not for what was happening now, but for that little boy who used to hold my hand in parking lots and ask me questions about clouds. I missed him. I still miss him. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of moment. You can be completely right and still grieve something. Over the next few weeks, Kevin and Tiffany did move out, not gracefully and not without several very uncomfortable conversations, but they did it. They moved in temporarily with Tiffany's parents in Indianapolis. Kevin found a job, a real one, at a distribution company. Nothing glamorous but steady. We spoke on the phone a few times. The conversations were careful. We were both learning how to talk to each other again. Or maybe for the first time. Tiffany posted something on her social media. I know because my daughter called to warn me. It wasn't specific, but it was pointed. Something about when family shows you who they really are, with a photo of a closed door. She got a few hundred likes. I chose not to look at it more than once. I was in Sarasota through December. I got the condo back into the shape I wanted it. I replaced the couch, kept the big gray sectional actually because it was more comfortable than the love seat. And I'm 63 years old and my back doesn't need any more opinions from me about furniture. I put a small plant on the balcony. I had dinner with Rosemary twice a week. I went to a yoga class. I hadn't done yoga in 4 years. I was terrible at it, and I went back the next week anyway. What I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because I think some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, is that I spent most of my adult life believing that loving someone meant absorbing the cost of their choices. That's what I modeled, and that's what I taught without meaning to. Every time I covered a bill without being asked, every time I said yes before I thought about whether I should, I was teaching Kevin that I was a resource to be used when things got hard. I don't say that to punish myself. I say it because understanding it is the only way I know to do something different. Kevin and I still talk. It's getting easier, slowly. He is working on things. I believe that. A few weeks ago, he sent me a card in the mail, an actual card, handwritten, that said he knew he had let me down and that he wanted to earn my trust back, not ask for it. I put it on my refrigerator. Tiffany and I are cordial when we have to be. I hold no particular malice toward her. She is a young woman who was also taught certain things, and she's living those lessons out. That's between her and Kevin to figure out. What I know is this. I drove 14 hours alone, walked into my own home, sat down on a couch that wasn't mine, and waited. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just waited with a folder of paperwork and 30 years of knowing my own name on a deed. And that was enough. My balcony doesn't look over a parking lot anymore, by the way. I never had it in me to move the potted herbs I've got lined up there now, rosemary and basil and a little mint that's getting out of control. So the view is mostly green. It's not Niagara Falls. It's not anything postcard worthy, but it's mine, and I'm here. And some mornings I stand out there with my coffee before the Florida heat really gets going, and I think, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. That took me 63 years to be able to say, I'm not going to let anyone take it from me again. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in any grand philosophical way, just in the very ordinary kitchen table way of looking back at a sequence of events and seeing how clearly one thing led to another. How every time I handed Kevin money without asking him to account for it, I was teaching him something. How every time I swallowed a concern because I didn't want to be that kind of mother, I was building a wall between us, one quiet brick at a time. The condo situation didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical end of a long pattern, and I was as much a part of building that pattern as he was. That's not easy to say. But I think it's true, and I've gotten to an age where I'd rather say the true thing than the comfortable one. What I know about Tiffany is that she learned early that confidence can substitute for accountability. She walked into my home, rearranged my belongings, took down my photographs, and still managed to look at me like I was the unreasonable one. That takes a certain kind of practiced audacity. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she's a person who was never made to feel the weight of her own choices, and so she doesn't feel it. That's not an excuse, it's just an explanation, and there's a difference. Kevin grew up watching me absorb things. Absorb the grief of losing Ray. Absorb the financial stress of raising 2 kids alone. Absorb every inconvenience and setback without complaint. Because that was what I believed strength looked like. I was wrong about that. Absorbing isn't strength. Absorbing without limit is just a slower way of disappearing. What I showed Kevin, without meaning to, was that the person who loves you most is the one who costs the least to take from. I think about the woman who drove 14 hours alone, walked into her own living room, sat down on a couch she didn't recognize, and waited. Hands steady, folder on her lap. I'm proud of her. I'm proud that she didn't cry in front of anyone until she was alone in her own bedroom that night with the door closed. I'm proud that she was calm, not because she was numb, but because she had decided in advance what she believed, and she held to it. There's something about getting older that people don't talk about enough, and it's this. Clarity gets easier. Not everything gets easier. The knees, the sleep, the feeling that the world is moving faster than you can quite follow. But clarity does. You start to understand what you actually value, not what you've been told to value. You start to understand that patience is not the same thing as permission. That loving someone does not obligate you to fund the version of themselves they're unwilling to examine. Kevin sent me a card a few weeks ago, handwritten. He said he wanted to earn my trust back, not ask for it. I read that 3 times. I put it on the refrigerator. That's not an ending. That's a beginning of something that might take years and might not finish the way either of us imagines. But it's real, and real is what I have to work with. The mint on my balcony is completely out of control, by the way. I'm going to have to do something about it soon. But not today. Today I have coffee and the early morning quiet before the Florida heat settles in, and a view that is entirely unambiguously mine. That's enough. That's more than enough.